Thank you, Dave. Good evening. Zechariah 4:10 says, "Who has despised the day of small things?" Have you? As business leaders, you all know that temptation is always there to do exactly that. Despise the day of small things. And also, don't ever say that you, as one businessman or one businesswoman, cannot change the world for Christ. Let me tell you about one businessman who did change the world for Christ. One of the greatest revivals in all of history that most people have never heard of is the Layman's Prayer Revival. The reason most people have never heard of it is because there was no major preacher or leader in this revival. It was, as it says, a layman's revival led entirely by laymen, and it began in 1857 with New York City lay missionary and businessman Jeremiah Lanphier, there you see him, who was a convert in Charles Finney's church, just an ordinary guy. Charles Finney was a pastor in New York City who was already famous at that time as a major figure in America's Second Great Awakening. Jeremiah Lanphier felt led to start a weekly noontime prayer meeting. The meetings were to be held Wednesday on the third floor of the Old North Dutch Reformed Church on Fulton Street for anyone to attend for a few minutes or for the entire hour. Jeremiah printed pamphlets entitled, "How Often Should I Pray?" He dropped them off nearby businesses and placed one on the church door. The first meeting, Jeremiah Lanphier prayed alone for the first half hour. Everybody say alone. He prayed alone for the first half hour. Never despise the day of small things. Then after praying alone for a half hour, 6 other men from different denominations came and joined him. Following Wednesday, there were 20, then 40. Before long, the meetings were held daily instead of weekly, but that did not alleviate the crowds as over 100, including many unsaved people, started coming. Within a month, similar meetings were being held at other churches, which also became overcrowded. Newspapers reported an unusual spirit of prayer as men and women, young and old, from every denomination came to experience the presence of God. Within 3 months, similar meetings were springing up all across America, while the original meetings had hundreds attending, with hundreds more being turned away. Then a theater was opened for prayer, still with many more being turned away. Now there were 6,000 people attending 100 meetings in Manhattan and Brooklyn alone. Even the secular press reported people experiencing the presence of God. Local businesses shut down. Shop signs read, "Closed, will reopen after prayer meeting." In Philadelphia, concert halls, fire stations, houses, and tents were filled. Some churches reported 5,000 new converts. One tent meeting reported 150,000 in 4 months. Soon, similar prayer meetings were being held in Boston, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Richmond, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, and elsewhere. Even President Franklin Pierce attended noontime prayer meetings. One man traveling east to Boston from Omaha, Nebraska, said, "On my journey east," next slide, "I have found a continuous prayer meeting about 2,000 miles in extent." Noticeably absent from the revival was any human organization or leadership. There were no preachers, just a revival built entirely on lay people, the Spirit of God, and miraculous answers to prayer. Also noteworthy was the unusual display of unity among all denominations and backgrounds. Even sinners felt comfortable coming to the meetings to receive Jesus. Others requested prayer for unsaved friends and loved ones. Telegraph companies allowed messages to be sent free of charge at certain times of the day as the flood of national testimonies seemed endless. One father requested prayer for his 3 unsaved sons living in another part of the country and soon received a letter stating that all 3 of them had been saved. Another requested prayer for his unsaved son on board a ship in the Pacific and soon received news of his conversion, which happened at the same time they prayed. Another group in Columbus, Ohio, prayed for their public schools, and all but 2 students in their high school got saved. Those on board ships heading for America reported sensing the presence of God when coming within 100 miles of the eastern shoreline. One ship felt God's presence so strongly they had a revival before they landed. Before the ship could anchor, the captain had to request a minister be brought on board to pray for all the people who were crying. A smaller commercial vessel reported everyone on board being converted within 100 miles, 150 miles actually, of the eastern seaboard. Even the USS Battleship North Carolina, stationed in New York Harbor, experienced a revival. 4 Christians began holding prayer meetings in the lower deck when others heard them singing and began mocking them. But then the power of God hit them, and they too fell on their knees, crying for mercy. Hundreds on the ship were saved, and those who transferred to other ships began holding revivals of their own. A typical prayer meeting was opened with singing the first 2 stanzas of a hymn, followed by a brief prayer from a lay leader or minister. The meetings were then open to anyone who wanted to pray or speak, but no more than 5 minutes. If someone went over time, a bell was rung and someone else would take their turn. Prayer requests and testimonies were often read, and brief exhortations were given on prayer or revival, but all within the time limit. A leader would then close the meeting by pronouncing the benediction. Meetings were described as solemn, earnest, filled with awe, and overpowering. Even 4 years later, as the American Civil War began, the prayer revival continued on both sides. A strong prayer revival broke out among Southern troops stationed in Richmond. It began in the hospitals among the wounded and then spread into the camps as the wounded returned to active duty. Prayer meetings were again organized as hundreds were converted. This soon spread to troops throughout the Confederate armies. Such revivals were encouraged by General Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Chaplains and missionaries were allowed to distribute tracts and ministers to the troops throughout the war. Later, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia experienced what some called the Great Revival of 1863, in which thousands were converted. By war's end, 150,000 Southern soldiers had been converted, and at least a third of them became praying men. In all, the prayer revival begun by Jeremiah Lanphier led to the conversion of between 6 and 7% of the U.S. population and about 21% of the Confederate Army. Then, as news of the prayer revival spread to England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and other British settlements around the world, reports of a continuous Pentecost and a rushing mighty wind poured in from all over the world. Not a bad day's work for one layman, one businessman. Never despise the day of small things, and never say that you, one businessman or one woman, cannot change the world for Christ. And if you want an example of a woman who's changing the world for Christ, there's one sitting right over here right now, Janet Porter. Amen. Thank you so much.